funeral home smelled like lilies and polished wood, a heavy, suffocating perfume that clung to every breath I took. I stood near Alexander's casket, numb, holding onto the edge of the podium for balance, as the murmurs of the crowd blurred into background noise. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day to honor the man I had built my life around. Instead, it became the day I truly saw him for who he had been. The church doors creaked open, and when I turned, I saw her, Vanessa Reed. She strolled in like she owned the room, wearing a fire-red dress that clashed violently with the somber blacks and grays around her. Heads turned, whispers ignited. My heart skipped a beat, then slammed painfully against my ribs. She met my gaze across the aisle, her lips curling into a slow, deliberate smirk. The kind someone gives when they think they've won. Like she was the true wife now, like my pain was her trophy. I could feel the eyes of the mourners shift between us, hungry for a scene, for drama, for anything to tear into later. My fingers tightened around my handbag. For a split second, the old me, the one who would shrink, who would cry in the bathroom, stall, who would pretend it didn't hurt, threatened to take over. But not today. I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a thick wool blanket. Vanessa took a few arrogant steps forward, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. She tilted her head, eyebrows raised as if daring me to fall apart. Instead, I smiled, small, controlled, almost polite. Without a word, I unzipped my purse, reached inside and pulled out the neatly folded document I had tucked there that morning. The paper felt cool and stiff between my fingers. I held it out to her, steady, unwavering. She hesitated, then plucked it from my hand with a smug flick of her wrist. But as she unfolded it, I watched her expression falter. The blood drained from her face. The smirk vanished. Her fingers trembled as her eyes scanned the lines that spelled out everything she thought she had claimed. Slipping right through her hands, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I turned away from her, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, the final sound in a room that had gone utterly silent. In that moment, I wasn't just Alexander's widow. I was something else entirely. Something stronger. Something reborn. Before everything shattered, my life with Alexander was the kind of story people envied. At least that's what I believed. We lived in a 2-story brick house on Maple Street, the kind of place with a tire swing in the backyard and flowers spilling out of window boxes in the spring. Every corner of that house had a memory. Late-night talks on the porch, lazy Sunday mornings tangled in blankets, the smell of Alexander's coffee brewing before the sun came up. We were married for 18 years. I met him in college when I was barely 20. He was studying business. I was chasing a degree in literature. He used to call me his dreamer, teasing me for always having my nose buried in a book. But I didn't mind. His ambition anchored me. He had a plan for life, and I trusted that plan with everything I had. After we married, I let my dreams bend to fit our shared life. I passed up a graduate program offer because Alexander's new job meant we had to move across the state. I told myself it was just a small sacrifice, one of many we would both make along the way. I found work wherever I could, tutoring part-time jobs, freelance writing, anything to keep us afloat while he built his career. There were years that felt like magic. I remember decorating our first Christmas tree together, standing barefoot in the kitchen, cooking dinners from recipes we'd torn out of magazines, laughing until our sides hurt when we burned our first Thanksgiving turkey. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Or so I thought. Happiness. I learned isn't always loud. Sometimes it hums quietly under the surface, making you believe everything is exactly as it should be. Alexander had dreams bigger than the life we were living. Though he worked long hours, chasing promotions, building a reputation in the local business world, I was proud of him. I supported every late meeting, every last-minute trip. I told myself his success was our success. Whenever he came home exhausted and distracted, I would brush it off thinking it was just part of being a man carrying the weight of ambition. Our relationship was built on the routines we created. Saturday morning pancakes monthly, date nights at the same Italian restaurant, Sunday drives through the countryside even when gas prices went up. I thought the small gestures were enough. I thought the love we started with would weather any storm. It wasn't that we didn't argue, we did. But they were the harmless kind of fights. Who left the lights on, who forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. We would go to bed annoyed and wake up tangled around each other. Arguments forgotten in the morning light. That was life. That was marriage, I thought. Looking back, there were signs I should have seen. The missed calls, he never explained. The business trips that extended an extra day or two. The way he grew quieter after certain phone conversations. But love can be a thick kind of blindness. I wore it like armor, shielding myself from questions. I didn't want to ask, Catherine. My sister tried to warn me once. She didn't come out and say it. She just asked gently if I ever worried about how much time Alexander was spending at work. I laughed it off. I told her that ambition was part of who he was, part of why I loved him. She nodded but didn't push. I was grateful then. Now I wish she had. My whole world rested on the belief that Alexander loved me, the way I loved him. That no matter how busy he got, no matter how many people he met, he would always come home to me. I believed that loyalty was a given, something automatic like breathing. The cruelest betrayals are the ones you don't see coming, the ones you don't prepare for, because you think you're safe. In those early days before the cracks became canyons, I would have sworn up and down that I was the luckiest woman in the world. I loved him with a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that settles deep into your bones, becoming part of who you are. He was my best friend, my partner, the person I trusted most. I built my life around that trust, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, never imagining that one day he would be the one to tear it down, never imagining that the man who once kissed me with the promise of forever would leave me standing alone, holding pieces of a life he had so carelessly discarded. But at the time, in those quiet content years, I didn't know any of that. I thought I had everything I ever wanted. It happened at the company's annual gala, a glittering night meant to celebrate another successful year. Alexander was being honored with an award for leadership excellence, and I had spent the entire afternoon getting ready, wanting to look like the proud wife I was supposed to be. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, the tables draped in crisp white linens, the air thick with the scent of wine and ambition. I wore a navy blue dress Alexander had once said was his favorite. I wanted to make him proud to be the woman he could show off that night. At first, everything felt perfect. Alexander introduced me to his colleagues, shook hands, made toasts. He looked every bit the man I fell in love with. Confident, charismatic, magnetic. I stood by his side, smiling through the small talk, feeling like we had built something real, something worth celebrating. Then I saw her, Vanessa Reed, the new executive assistant everyone at the firm had been whispering about. She was younger, maybe 10 years my junior, with sleek blonde hair and a body built for attention. She wore a fitted black dress more suited to a nightclub than a professional event, and she carried herself like she knew she was being watched. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Assistants attended these things too. It wasn't strange, I told myself that. But when Alexander saw her, something shifted. His smile softened a little too much. His eyes lingered a little too long. And when she sauntered over to our table, he didn't introduce her as his assistant. He introduced her as Vanessa, like she was someone I should already know, someone important. She laughed a light, breathy sound and touched his arm as she congratulated him. Not just a pat, a lingering touch, familiar, proprietary. My stomach tightened, but I forced a smile, shaking her hand when it was offered. "Rebecca Wright." She said, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. Pity amusement I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking. Alexander didn't notice the awkwardness. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. He spent the next hour orbiting between conversations, but somehow Vanessa was always nearby, fetching him drinks, laughing at his jokes a little too loudly, leaning in a little too close. At one point, while Alexander was pulled into a conversation across the room, Catherine, who had come as my guest, leaned over and whispered, "That's not just work, Becca. Look at the way she watches him." I shook my head. He's her boss. She's just being friendly. I said, hearing the defensiveness in my own voice. I wanted so badly to believe it. I needed to. Catherine didn't push. She just gave me that sad, knowing look only an older sister can give. The kind that says she sees something you don't want to admit. Later that night, during Alexander's acceptance speech, he stood at the podium smiling under the warm glow of the spotlight. He thanked his team, his mentors, even Vanessa by name, for her incredible support in helping him manage the year's challenges. He didn't mention me, not once. I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, willing myself not to let the sting show on my face. I clapped when everyone else did. I smiled when he returned to our table, beaming and proud. But something inside me shifted almost imperceptibly, like the tiniest crack forming in a foundation that had once felt unbreakable. That night, lying in bed next to Alexander as he snored softly, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I thought about Vanessa's hand on his arm, about the way he had looked through me, as if I were part of the decor, about the speech where I had become invisible. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was tired, that the night had been overwhelming for both of us. I pushed the unease down so deep I almost believed it wasn't there. After all, he came home with me, didn't he? We slept under the same roof, shared the same life. Surely that mattered more than a few strange moments. I buried the first seed of doubt, packing it away with all the other worries I didn't have the strength to face. I didn't know it then. But that night was the first fracture in a life I had built on trust. It would not be the last. After the gala, things didn't fall apart overnight. They wore down slowly, piece by piece, the way a coastline erodes under relentless waves. Not with one crash, but with 1,000 tiny pulls. It started with the little things. Alexander became distracted at home, lost in thought, even when he was sitting right next to me. He stopped asking about my day, if I volunteered details how my tutoring students were doing, the small milestones I reached at work. He nodded absently without really hearing me. I could tell by the way his eyes stayed glued to his phone, the way he muttered responses just to fill the silence. At first, I made excuses for him. Work was stressful. The economy was unpredictable. He needed space-time to unwind. I cooked his favorite meals. I gave him back rubs after long days. I filled the empty spaces between us with patience, telling myself that's what marriage meant, sticking it out through hard seasons. The patience began to feel like shouting into an empty canyon. Alexander stopped noticing the little things. When I got a haircut, a drastic change, I thought he might at least comment on, he didn't even blink. When our anniversary rolled around, he sent me a text at noon that said, "Happy anniversary. Love you." No card, no flowers, no dinner plans. I told myself it didn't matter that real love wasn't measured in grand gestures, but a small aching part of me still waited for something more. We stopped laughing together. The inside jokes, the playful teasing, the easy companionship that once anchored us, all of it, faded into a polite but distant coexistence. Our conversations became transactional. "What do you want for dinner?" "Don't forget your appointment. Did you pay the electric bill?" He was still there, but he wasn't with me anymore. The worst part wasn't the fighting. It was the silence. Silence at dinner broken only by the clink of forks against plates. Silence in the car as we drove side by side like strangers. Silence in bed when I lay awake listening to him breathe, wondering if he was dreaming of someone else. One night I worked up the courage to ask him, "Are you happy?" He looked up from his phone, startled as if I'd interrupted a world he had long since built without me. "Yeah?" he said. "Why wouldn't I be?" I nodded and smiled like that answer was enough. But inside I felt something small and important slip further out of reach. Catherine noticed the change before I did. She came over one afternoon with coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table watching me too closely. "You're fading, Beck," she said gently. "You're not you anymore." I waved her off. "It's just a rough patch. Every marriage goes through them." She didn't argue. She just squeezed my hand. Her eyes filled with the kind of pity I wasn't ready to accept yet. There were no grand betrayals yet, no shocking scenes. Just the quiet, relentless diminishing of myself. I became someone I barely recognized. Someone who tiptoed around her own home trying not to upset a balance that had already shattered. I stopped bringing up my successes because they were met with indifference. I stopped suggesting date nights because he was always too tired. I stopped expecting affection because it hurt too much to be met with coldness. I shrank to fit the spaces Alexander allowed me, and each time I made myself smaller, a part of me disappeared. Still, I told myself this was temporary, that marriage meant riding out the seasons, even when the winters seemed endless. I told myself that if I just loved him, harder, waited longer, sacrificed more, he would find his way back to me. But love is not a cure for neglect, and waiting is not a promise that someone will choose you again. Looking back, I realized the erosion had been happening for years, hidden under the routines and responsibilities that numbed us both. But now it was undeniable the love I had clung to so fiercely had withered, leaving behind only the hollow rituals of a life built on memories instead of hope. The man I had once built my world around was slipping away one quiet act of indifference at a time, and I was standing still, letting him go too, afraid to face the truth of what was happening. It wasn't just the small private dismissals that chipped away at me. It was the moment he made me invisible in front of the people who knew us best. The moment the walls of our marriage cracked, not just inside our home, but under the eyes of everyone I had spent years letting into my life. It happened at my parents' anniversary party. They were celebrating 35 years together, a big milestone in our family. Something my mother had dreamed about since the day she and my father first said, "I do." I helped organize the whole thing, the decorations, the caterers, the guest list. I spent weeks coordinating everything down to the smallest details, because if there was one thing I could still control, it was making sure someone else's love story stayed intact. The party was held at the local community hall, strung with fairy lights and filled with laughter, clinking glasses and old songs from a rented DJ. My parents beamed the entire night, holding hands, swaying slowly to music. Only they could hear. They were the kind of couple I used to believe Alexander and I would become. I stood near the buffet table chatting with relatives when I caught sight of Alexander across the room. He was laughing, really laughing, the way he hadn't with me in months. And there next to him was Vanessa. She wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't a work event. This was family. Alexander must have invited her on his own. Maybe he told himself it was harmless. Or maybe he didn't care anymore about appearances. Either way, there she was, weaving herself into my family celebration, laughing with my cousins, sipping wine, looking like she belonged. When Alexander noticed me watching, he didn't look guilty. He waved me over with a casual flick of his hand, like a man summoning a waitress. I made my way over, forcing a smile. "This is Vanessa," Alexander said, slinging his arm around her shoulders in a way that was just a little too familiar. "You know my assistant, she saved my life last quarter." I nodded, extending a hand. Vanessa barely bothered to shake. "And this," Alexander continued, turning back to Vanessa without even glancing at me, "is Rebecca? She keeps everything running at home?" There was laughter, actual out loud laughter from the small group around us. Someone, maybe my cousin's wife, chuckled and said, "Behind every great man, right?" I stood there, cheeks burning, as Vanessa giggled into her wine glass, clearly understanding the hierarchy Alexander had just drawn in a few careless words. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was the help. It would have been easier if he had slapped me across the face. At least then it would have felt real justified. Instead, I stood there, frozen, holding a flimsy paper plate of food. The room spinning a little as the laughter faded and the conversations moved on without me. Alexander didn't notice that I hadn't laughed. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled or how my throat closed up until breathing felt like a conscious act of will. He just clapped Vanessa on the back and said something about grabbing another drink, walking away without a second glance. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me as quickly as I could. In the dim light, I stared at my reflection. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her lipstick was smudged. Her hair had wilted under the humidity. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, looked dull, empty. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned white, willing myself not to cry. Not here. Not tonight. Not when my parents deserved to remember this night without my sadness, staining it. I reapplied my lipstick with shaky hands, plastered a smile onto my face, and stepped back into the hall, as if nothing had happened. I congratulated my parents, hugged relatives, posed for photos. I became a ghost in my own life, moving through the motions, because that was easier than explaining the hollow space that had cracked wide open inside me. Catherine caught my eye across the room later that night. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her face said it all. "I see you, I'm sorry. You don't deserve this." I smiled back, grateful for her silent understanding, but more ashamed than ever that this was now my story. Not the fairy tale I once believed in. Not the partnership I had sacrificed so much to protect just a woman standing alone in a crowded room, pretending she still mattered to the man who had already moved on. Right in front of her. Leaving wasn't some grand moment of bravery. It wasn't a cinematic scene where I packed my bags in the middle of a storm, shouting final words through tears. It was quieter than that, smaller, like the soft click of a door closing behind you. It happened a few weeks after my parents' anniversary party, after Vanessa's presence had wormed her way into every corner of our lives without permission. By then, she wasn't just at work events. She was showing up at casual dinners, popping into birthday parties, hanging around our friends like she belonged. And Alexander didn't stop it. He welcomed it. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized how deeply he had erased me from his world, or if he simply didn't care anymore. The night I left wasn't special. There was no big fight, no raised voices, no broken dishes or slammed doors. Just a silence so thick it felt like drowning. We were sitting at opposite ends of the living room. Me with a book I wasn't reading. Alexander scrolling through his phone, the TV humming with a baseball game. Neither of us was watching. I glanced at him, studying his face, the curve of his jawline, the familiar crease between his brows. I knew every inch of him. I had once loved him, the way a drowning person clings to the surface of the water, desperate, all-consuming. But now looking at him, I felt nothing but a hollow ache. The realization settled in slowly, like cold air seeping through a crack in a window. I wasn't home anymore. I was just there, taking up space in a life that no longer wanted me. I set the book down carefully and stood up. Alexander didn't look away from his phone, didn't ask where I was going, didn't even flinch. In the bedroom, I opened the closet and pulled out a small overnight bag, the kind you pack for quick trips or last-minute weekends away. I didn't take much, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, my favorite worn sweater that still smelled like better times. I moved slowly, methodically, half expecting him to come down the hallway and ask me what I was doing. Half hoping maybe that he would notice. He didn't. When I zipped the bag closed, the sound echoed loudly in the empty room. For a moment, I sat on the edge of the bed, our bed tracing the stitching on the comforter we had picked out together. Years ago, I remembered the excitement we felt furnishing our first home. How we fought over paint colors, how we compromised on that ridiculous floral duvet I secretly hated because Alexander thought it was cozy. I used to believe memories like that could anchor a marriage through anything. I was wrong. I left a note on the dresser short, just enough to say, "I'm staying with Catherine for a while. I need space. Please don't call." Even writing it. My hand trembled, not from fear, from grief. Grief for the girl who once believed love alone could fix everything. I carried my bag downstairs. Alexander was still on the couch, still scrolling, still silent. I paused in the doorway, waiting. One last chance, one last opportunity for him to look up and realize he was losing me. But he didn't. I turned the knob and stepped outside, the evening air hitting me like a wave. I didn't slam the door behind me. I didn't make a scene. I didn't want drama. I just left Catherine's house, was only a few miles away. But the drive felt endless. Every mile was a tug of war between guilt and freedom. Was I giving up too soon? Was I betraying vows that were supposed to be unbreakable? Or was I finally choosing myself for the first time in years? When I pulled into Catherine's driveway, she was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed, face soft with understanding. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just took my bag from my hand, pulled me into a hug and said, "You're not alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself cry. Silent, broken sobs that had been building inside me for months, maybe even years, spilled out into the night. I cried for the love I lost, for the woman I lost, for the future that no longer existed. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know if I was strong enough to rebuild. All I knew was that I had finally stopped standing still in a life that had long since stopped being mine. And even through the tears buried under all the pain was the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time: hope. Rock bottom doesn't announce itself with a crash. It doesn't come with sirens or flashing lights. It creeps in slow and suffocating until one day you wake up and realize you're sitting at the bottom of a life you don't recognize anymore. For me, it happened 2 weeks after I moved in with Catherine. At first, I thought the distance would give me clarity. I thought sleeping in a different bed, breathing different air would somehow snap me back into focus. But instead, the silence swallowed me whole. Catherine had gone to work. I sat at her kitchen table alone, the morning sun spilling through the windows in thin, weak beams. A half-empty coffee cup cooled in front of me, untouched. I stared at it for what felt like hours. The world outside the glass, moving forward while I stayed frozen in place. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Days blurred together, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. I scrolled through my phone aimlessly, rereading old texts. Alexander had sent me the sweet ones, the ones from the early years. I tried to reconcile the man in those messages with the one who hadn't even bothered to stop me when I left. My body moved, but my mind floated somewhere else, detached and numb. One afternoon, I decided to go back to the house. I told myself I just needed a few things, some clothes, a few books, my laptop. But deep down, I was chasing a ghost. I needed to see if any part of my old life was still salvageable. The driveway looked the same. The garden I had painstakingly planted bloomed in reckless color. From the outside, it was as if nothing had changed. But when I stepped through the front door, the air felt different, colder, empty in a way I couldn't explain. Alexander wasn't home. Good. I didn't think I could face him without falling apart. I moved through the house carefully, like a visitor, afraid of disturbing the ruins of something sacred. In the living room, I found a new framed photo on the mantel, a picture of Alexander at a work event. Vanessa stood beside him, smiling brightly, her arm around his waist. There was no trace of me left in the frame. No room for me in that picture. I turned away quickly, swallowing the sting. Upstairs in our bedroom, the bed was unmade, something Alexander would never have tolerated before. His things were scattered across the dresser, the closet doors left open, shirts and jackets tossed carelessly inside. A woman's perfume lingered faintly in the air, floral and sharp, so unlike anything I ever wore. I sat down on the edge of the bed, clutching the small box of belongings I had gathered, a framed photo of our wedding day. A few books he never cared to read, my favorite scarf abandoned on the back of a chair. It hit me then full force, the finality of it all. There was no saving this, no mending what had been so thoroughly discarded. I wasn't just out of the house. I was out of his life, erased, replaced, forgotten. Tears welled up, but I didn't fight them. I let them fall silent and steady, soaking into the fabric of the comforter beneath me. I cried for the years I had poured into a man who had built a future without me. I cried for the version of myself who had believed love alone could be enough. The walls of the bedroom, once filled with whispered dreams and late-night laughter, now closed in around me like a tomb. That was my rock bottom, sitting alone in the middle of a life that used to be mine, realizing it had never truly belonged to me at all. I left without looking back. The drive back to Catherine's was a blur. I don't remember the streets or the stoplights. I only remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly. My hands hurt, and forcing myself to breathe, one shaky inhale at a time. When I got back to Catherine's, I didn't speak. I crawled into the guest bed, still fully dressed, and pulled the covers over my head. I stayed there for hours, maybe days, letting the weight of my grief crush every last ounce of resistance inside me. There's a kind of death in letting go of a life you thought was yours, and before you can rebuild, you have to grieve that loss completely. In that dark, hollow space, something inside me broke wide open. But what I didn't realize yet, what I couldn't see through the thick fog of pain, was that sometimes the breaking is necessary. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you needed just to find the pieces of yourself that were waiting to be claimed. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, one of those gray, shapeless days where time barely moves. Catherine had gone out to run errands, leaving me alone, with my thoughts the low hum of the dishwasher and the quiet weight of the house pressing down on me. I wandered through her guest room, aimlessly opening drawers, trying to find something, anything to distract myself. That's when I found it, a small box tucked in the back of my overnight bag. I must have packed it without thinking. The night I left Alexander. In my hurry, in my desperation to escape, I pulled it out, brushing dust from the lid. It was an old, battered jewelry box, one Alexander had given me on our 10th anniversary, back when gifts still meant something. Inside were a few keepsakes I hadn't looked at in years, a pair of earrings from our honeymoon, a love note he had written when he proposed, and tucked underneath everything, a thick envelope. I frowned, pulling it free. It was labeled in Alexander's careful handwriting, Prenuptial Agreement 2003. I sat down heavily on the bed, the envelope trembling in my hands. I had almost forgotten about the prenup. Back then it felt like a formality, something his lawyer had insisted on because of his family's minor wealth. We had laughed about it at the time, promising each other that it would never matter, that love made documents like that obsolete. But now, with my heart hollowed out and my future uncertain, it felt like a lifeline. I slid the papers out and began reading. At first, it was the usual language: property division, debt responsibilities, the standard protections. But halfway through, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, a clause, buried neatly in the legal jargon that spelled out the consequences of infidelity. If Alexander ever engaged in an extramarital relationship during our marriage, he forfeited all claims to any jointly held assets. Everything would default to me. The words blurred on the page as tears filled my eyes, but not from sadness this time, from shock, from vindication, from the smallest, fiercest spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Alexander hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had broken a legal promise, a promise that stripped him of the very things he and Vanessa had likely assumed would fall into their laps. I clutched the document to my chest, shaking with the enormity of what it meant. For the first time since I walked out that door, the balance shifted. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't some discarded wife to be pitied. I had rights. I had protection. And I had proof. My mind raced, connecting pieces I hadn't dared connect before. The rushed business trips, the unexplained absences, Vanessa's smugness at family events, all of it leading up to a truth I could no longer deny and could now finally do something about. The discovery wasn't just about the prenup. It was about seeing myself clearly for the first time in months, maybe even years. I'd spent so long shrinking, trying to make myself smaller, to fit inside Alexander's shrinking love. I had forgotten that I was a whole person before him, capable, intelligent, worthy. I had forgotten that I had the right to stand tall, to protect myself, to fight for the life I deserved. The prenup was more than a document. It was a mirror reflecting back the version of me I thought I had lost. I carefully refolded the papers, placed them back into the envelope, and slid it into my purse. It didn't change the heartbreak. It didn't erase the years I had given to a man who stopped loving me long before he had the courage to say so. But it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. A path forward. No more begging for scraps of affection. No more mourning a man who had chosen someone else. No more standing still while life passed me by. For the first time in months, maybe longer, I smiled, small, fierce, and entirely for myself. The war for my heart was over. The battle for my future had just begun. And this time, I wasn't fighting to be loved. I was fighting to be free. Awakening doesn't feel like a lightning strike. It doesn't crash into you with sudden clarity. It's quieter than that. Almost gentle, like the slow lifting of fog from a familiar road. You forgot it was even there. The morning after I found the prenup, I woke up feeling different. Not healed, not whole, but different. For the first time in months, my first thought wasn't about Alexander. It wasn't about Vanessa or the life I lost or the years I had wasted. It was about me. I sat up in bed feeling the early light filter through Catherine's gauzy curtains. The air smelled like coffee brewing downstairs. And somewhere deep inside me, a part of myself, a part I thought had died, stirred awake. I got dressed slowly, choosing clothes that made me feel strong rather than invisible. I pulled on a pair of dark jeans, a fitted sweater, simple gold earrings. No more baggy sweatshirts or hiding behind messy buns and tired faces. If I was going to reclaim my life, I was going to look like I deserved it, even if on the inside, I still felt fragile. Downstairs, Catherine was sitting at the table reading the newspaper, her glasses perched low on her nose. She looked up when she heard me, and for a moment she just stared as if noticing the change in me before I even said a word. "Morning," she said carefully, gauging my mood. "Morning." I replied, my voice stronger than I expected. I poured myself a cup of coffee, savoring the normalcy of it, the small reclaiming of ordinary life. I didn't launch into my usual monologue about how heartbroken I was. I didn't cry. I just sat down across from her. Calm, composed, Catherine set down the paper and studied me for a long moment. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked. Not unkindly. I nodded, sliding the prenup across the table. She read it quickly, her eyes widening slightly as she reached the infidelity clause. "Rebecca," she whispered. I didn't need her to say anything more. I didn't need anyone to validate what I already knew. Alexander had broken something sacred, and in doing so, he had handed me the key to my own freedom. For years, I had convinced myself that strength meant staying, that love was proven through endurance, patience, sacrifice. But now I understood that sometimes strength means knowing when to stop pouring yourself into someone who keeps emptying you out. I wasn't going to be the woman who begged to be chosen. I wasn't going to be the footnote in Alexander's next chapter. I was going to be the author of my own story starting now. I spent the rest of the morning making calls, quiet, strategic calls. I contacted a lawyer. Catherine recommended a sharp woman named Caroline Blake, who specialized in family law. I gathered documents, financial statements, emails, anything that showed how Alexander had moved on, without even the courtesy of honesty. I wasn't rushing into battle. I was preparing for it. I didn't tell Alexander. I knew I didn't storm into his office, demanding explanations. I didn't show up crying on his doorstep, asking for closure. I let him live in the world he had created, oblivious, arrogant, careless. while I built a world of my own brick by brick. There was something strangely exhilarating about it, about moving in silence, about holding my truth close to my chest, like a secret weapon. Each small step, scheduling meetings, making copies, opening my own private bank account, was like laying a stone under my feet, building a new path forward, one that led away from him, one that led back to me. At night, I journaled not about Alexander, not about Vanessa. About myself, I wrote down memories of who I was before him, dreams I had shelved, passions I had abandoned, strengths I had forgotten. I made lists of things I wanted to do. Travel alone, start a new hobby, volunteer at a shelter, dye my hair a shade no one else chose for me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was awake. And with each passing day, the life I had been mourning seemed smaller, dimmer, less worthy of the grief I had given it. I wasn't just surviving now. I was reclaiming piece by piece, choice by choice, step by silent, powerful step. I didn't make grand announcements. I didn't shout my plans from rooftops or post cryptic quotes online. I moved quietly, deliberately, because real power doesn't beg for attention. It builds silently until it's too strong to ignore. The first thing I did was secure my finances. I met with Caroline Blake, the lawyer Catherine had recommended. She was calm sharp, the kind of woman who made you feel like you could survive anything just by sitting across the table from her. We met in a small office downtown tucked above a coffee shop, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Caroline read through the prenup carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly in approval. "You have more leverage than you think," she said. "If we do this right, he won't even see it coming." Hearing that felt like the first deep breath I had taken in months. Caroline outlined a simple but firm plan. Document everything: emails, text, messages, bank statements, showing unusual charges, separate finances, open a private checking account, reroute my paychecks, prepare emotionally, expect him to be shocked, angry, maybe even cruel, stay silent, let him think he's still winning. "Timing is everything," Caroline said. "Let him underestimate you. It will make your position stronger when the time comes." I nodded, committing every word to memory. After our meeting, I went straight to the bank. I opened a new account in my name. Only. The first thing in a long time that was truly, completely mine. I moved a small amount of money enough to support myself if things got messy quickly. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a seed of independence. Next, I retrieved all the personal documents I had stored over the years. Birth certificates, tax returns, insurance policies. I packed them neatly into a file folder and stored them at Catherine's house, hidden in the back of her coat closet. Somewhere safe, somewhere Alexander would never think to look. Every action I took, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. I went back to my own life quietly. Keeping everything as normal as possible from the outside, I answered Alexander's occasional texts. Short, polite responses that revealed nothing. I didn't fight. I didn't accuse. I didn't give him any reason to believe I was anything but heartbroken, powerless. Retreating. Inside, though, I was sharpening myself into someone he wouldn't recognize. At night, when the house was dark and Catherine had gone to bed, I sat up writing lists. People I needed to contact, things I needed to retrieve from the house, goals I wanted for my future, even if they scared me. It was strange how empowering it felt, planning a life that didn't orbit around someone else's approval. I stopped checking Alexander's social media. I stopped replaying our memories like broken tapes. I stopped wondering what he was thinking, what Vanessa was doing, What everyone else would say when they found out, it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't fighting to win him back. I wasn't fighting for their respect. I was fighting for my own freedom, the kind you build with steady hands, quiet resilience, and a refusal to be anyone's afterthought. There were moments when fear crept in. Of course, late at night, lying awake in the guest bedroom, I would sometimes panic, imagining court battles, vicious accusations, the loss of everything I had worked so hard to protect. But every time the fear rose up, I reminded myself, I have already survived worse. I survived the humiliation. I survived the betrayal. I survived being erased by the man I loved. I could survive this too. And more than survive, I could rebuild. Piece by piece, brick by brick, I was laying the foundation of a life that would not be dictated by broken promises or someone else's betrayal. I didn't need Alexander's permission. I didn't need Vanessa's approval. I didn't even need the world to cheer me on. I needed only myself. And that, I was learning, was more than enough. At first, nothing seemed different on the surface. Alexander still lived his life as if nothing had changed. He still posted pictures from work events, still flashed his easy smile in every photo. And Vanessa, she wasn't hiding anymore. Their connection, no longer whispered behind closed doors, was paraded like a badge of honor. But underneath that shiny surface, small cracks were starting to form. And this time they weren't in me. They were in him. It began with small inconveniences. Alexander called one afternoon to ask about a payment he thought I'd made, one of the joint bills we used to manage together. Calmly, I told him he'd need to check his account because I wasn't overseeing our finances anymore. There was a beat of silence on the line, like he was recalibrating, trying to fit this new version of me into the narrative he had built. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't fill the silence. I let him sit in it. After that, the messages became a little more frequent. Questions about paperwork, requests for things he couldn't find, hints that he was starting to realize he wasn't in control of the situation the way he had assumed. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Caroline continued to work her quiet magic. She filed the necessary legal documents to protect my interests without tipping our hand too early. She ensured that the financial accounts were being divided fairly, according to the prenup terms. She guided me on gathering every piece of evidence we might need, methodically, strategically, patiently. Alexander had no idea. He thought he had moved on, cleanly upgraded his life, upgraded his happiness. But real happiness doesn't come at the expense of someone else's dignity. And real freedom isn't built on betrayal. Every day I grew a little stronger, a little calmer, a little more sure that walking away had been the best decision I had ever made. The power between us was shifting, not because I fought louder, but because I fought smarter. I began reclaiming pieces of my identity. I returned to tutoring, something I had put aside for years while supporting Alexander's ambitions. I spent weekends volunteering at a local shelter, connecting with people who valued kindness over status. I filled my days with work, with laughter, with small, sacred moments of healing. The more I built a life without him, the less space he occupied in my heart, the less his choices defined my worth. People started to notice. At a neighborhood gathering, Catherine dragged me to one weekend. An old friend pulled me aside and said, "You look different, lighter, stronger." I smiled truly, meaning it, and said, "I am..." Meanwhile, the whispers about Alexander and Vanessa began to spread. Not because I said anything, I kept my dignity intact, but because truth has a way of surfacing without needing help. Co-workers noticed how quickly Vanessa had inserted herself into Alexander's personal and professional life. Friends noticed how Alexander seemed distracted, anxious, not the glowing picture of success he had painted. Even mutual acquaintances started asking quiet, careful questions, wondering if maybe there was more to the story than Alexander had let on. I didn't answer. I didn't defend him. I didn't explain. I simply smiled, the kind of smile that knows secrets are safest when held close and moved forward. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making him hurt the way he had hurt me. It was about standing in my own truth, without needing anyone else's permission. Alexander was slipping, and he didn't even realize it. He had traded something real for something shallow, and the consequences of that choice were beginning to echo louder than any words I could have spoken. I wasn't gloating, I wasn't celebrating. I was simply living fully, freely, and without fear. And in doing so, I was winning a victory far sweeter than any public spectacle could ever offer. Because the greatest power is not proving someone wrong. It's proving to yourself that you were always enough, even when they couldn't see it. And now, finally, I was starting to see it too. The confrontation didn't happen the way I used to imagine it during those long, painful nights. There were no screaming matches, no tears, no desperate pleas for explanations. When it finally came, it was quiet, sharp and final. The way real endings usually are. It happened at Alexander's funeral. Life has a way of delivering closure in forms you never expect. His heart gave out suddenly a massive heart attack. They said there was no drawn-out illness, no slow decline. One moment he was standing, breathing, planning another future that didn't include me, and the next he was gone. I didn't cry when I got the news. I sat in Catherine's kitchen holding the phone in my hand, long after the call ended, feeling nothing. No rage, no relief, no overwhelming grief. Just a heavy, aching emptiness. When the day of the funeral arrived, I knew I had to go. Not for him. Not even for closure for myself. I dressed in a simple black dress, pinned my hair back neatly, and wore no jewelry except for my wedding ring, the one symbol I had once cherished, and now wore as a reminder of everything I had survived. Catherine offered to come with me, but I shook my head. This was something I needed to face alone. The funeral home was packed. Alexander had been well-liked, well-connected faces I hadn't seen in years filled the pews. Colleagues, old friends, family members who had silently chosen sides when our marriage crumbled. I slipped into a seat near the back. Unnoticed by most, I didn't need to be front and center. I didn't need to perform grief for anyone. The service was exactly what you'd expect. Polished, respectful, full of words about what a good man he was. No one mentioned the betrayal, the lies, the wreckage he left behind. Death has a way of making saints out of sinners. I sat there still and silent, letting the words wash over me without ever sinking in. And then she walked in. Vanessa, dressed in a tight black dress that was far too revealing for the occasion. Heels clicking loudly against the tile floor. Shh. Turned whispers rippled through the room. She didn't bow her head. She didn't look sorrowful. She looked smug, like a woman who believed she had won. Her eyes scanned the room until they found me. And then the smirk, the small cruel curl of her lips that said more than words ever could. For a moment, the old me, the broken, humiliated version of myself almost flinched, almost shrank under the weight of her gaze. Almost, but then I remembered who I had become. Slowly, calmly, I stood up. I moved through the crowd, without rushing, without faltering. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded document I had carried with me, like a talisman, ever since I found it. the prenuptial agreement, I approached Vanessa with the same grace she thought she had stolen from me. She watched me come, confusion flickering briefly in her heavily made-up eyes. I stopped in front of her, close enough for the room to hush, close enough for the moment to carve itself permanently into everyone's memory. Without a word, I extended the paper toward her. She hesitated, then plucked it from my fingers with a smirk that was already beginning to falter. As she unfolded it, I stood still, hands calmly folded in front of me, watching her read the words that spelled out her defeat. Her face paled, her hands trembled. She glanced up at me, her mouth opening slightly, maybe to protest, maybe to beg, maybe to deny. It didn't matter. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a single word. I simply turned and walked away. The murmurs grew louder behind me, a rising tide of realization spreading through the room. But I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I stepped out into the sunlight, letting the door swing shut behind me, leaving the past and everyone clinging to it exactly where it belonged inside. In that moment, under the clear blue sky, I realized I didn't need revenge. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need anyone to understand my pain. I had delivered my truth without raising my voice, without shedding a tear. And that was the real victory. The woman who once begged for love, who once made herself small to be chosen, was gone. In her place stood someone unbreakable, someone free. Justice doesn't always come with loud announcements or bright lights. Sometimes it's quieter, almost elegant, like the closing of a final chapter. No one else even realizes has ended. After the funeral, there were no dramatic scenes, no tearful confessions, no late-night apologies. Vanessa stayed behind at the reception with the others, smiling tightly, pretending nothing had happened. But I knew, and soon she would know the full extent of what she had lost. The next few weeks unfolded with a strange, eerie calm. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't have to. Caroline had everything prepared, step by step, exactly as we planned. The reading of the will took place in a somber conference room downtown, attended by a handful of family members, a few of Alexander's business partners, and to no one's surprise, Vanessa. She strutted into the room wearing expensive sunglasses and a designer handbag radiating the confidence of someone certain she was about to inherit the life she had fought so hard to insert herself into. I sat quietly in the corner, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I didn't need to speak. The documents would do it for me. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a patient voice, began reading through Alexander's wishes. Some small gifts for nieces and nephews, donations to a few charities he cared about, and then the part everyone was waiting for, the distribution of assets. Vanessa's posture straightened. I could see her almost vibrating with anticipation. But when the lawyer explained clearly and without fanfare that the entirety of Alexander's estate, every property, every account, every investment would pass solely to me, based on the binding terms of our prenuptial agreement, something remarkable happened. The color drained from Vanessa's face so fast I thought she might faint. She leaned forward in her chair, stammering, "That's not possible. Alexander promised." The lawyer didn't even blink. He calmly pointed to the signed agreement notarized and filed years before. Vanessa had ever entered the picture. "According to this document," he said, tapping the paper gently, "any extramarital relationship voided Mr. Walsh's claim to shared assets. The agreement is legally binding. Mrs. Walsh retains full ownership." Silence swallowed the room. I sat still, feeling every eye flicker between Vanessa and me. But I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just sat there dignified and calm, the quiet embodiment of justice, realized. Vanessa tried to protest. She argued, begged, insisted she was owed something. Anything. But the law didn't care about promises whispered in secret. The law cared about what was written, signed and sealed. In the end, Vanessa walked out of that room with nothing but a broken dream and a tarnished reputation. She wasn't the victorious mistress walking away with the prize. She was a footnote to a man who had left a mess behind and wasn't even alive to clean it up. I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I had won. Not because I had taken back the house, the accounts, the assets. Because I had taken back myself, I had survived the humiliation. I had survived the betrayal, and now standing under the wide open sky, I had survived the final reckoning. No amount of money could measure what that meant. For years I had believed that love meant sacrifice, even when it hurt, even when it diminished me. But real love, the kind I was learning to have for myself, doesn't demand you vanish to make someone else comfortable. Real love says, stay grow, protect your heart. Justice, it turned out, wasn't about seeing someone else suffer. It wasn't about revenge, it was about finally knowing my worth and seeing it honored in ways that no betrayal could erase. As I walked to my car, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I looked older than I had before. All of this. There were fine lines around my eyes, a new firmness to my mouth. But I also looked stronger, rooted, unshakable. I smiled at the woman staring back at me. She had fought for her dignity without ever lowering herself. She had rebuilt herself from ashes without needing to shout about it. And in doing so, she had claimed a victory no one could ever take away. Not even death. The weeks after the will reading passed quietly. Not silent exactly, but peaceful, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No late-night arguments, no forced smiles at awkward dinners, no walking on eggshells around a man who had already made his decision long before I ever caught up to it. For the first time in a long while, my life belonged entirely to me. I filled my days with purpose work therapy, small joys like long walks and trying recipes I never had time for when I was married. Every tiny act felt like reclaiming territory that had been lost under years of sacrifice and silent sadness. And then one afternoon, the past came, knocking. Not in the way I expected, but in a way I didn't even know I had been hoping for. It was my mother-in-law, Eleanor Walsh. The last time I'd seen Eleanor was at Alexander's funeral. We had exchanged polite, distant nods, but no real words. I hadn't expected anything more. Eleanor had always been loyal to Alexander, blindly, sometimes painfully so. Even when cracks showed in our marriage, she brushed them off with comments like, "All men have their ways, dear. It's just part of marriage." But now she was standing on Catherine's porch, holding a tin of cookies like a peace offering. For a moment, I froze. Old instincts kicked in, the urge to protect myself, to guard against whatever judgment might come next. But something softer tugged at me too. A reminder that healing doesn't always come in the form you expect. I opened the door. "Eleanor," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Hi." She looked older than I remembered, more fragile. Her usually immaculate hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She clutched the tin awkwardly, as if it were a shield. "I hope it's not too late," she said, voice cracking slightly. I just wanted to talk." I hesitated just for a second, and then stepped aside to let her in. We sat at Catherine's kitchen table, the same one where I had rebuilt my life, piece by piece. The same one where I had cried and planned and healed. Eleanor placed the tin between us but didn't open it. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, eyes fixed on the worn wood grain of the table, "for everything." The words hung between us heavy and unfamiliar. "I didn't see," she continued, voice shaking. "I didn't want to see. I thought if I ignored it, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe my son was still the boy I raised, not the man he became." I swallowed hard, feeling old wounds stirring but not reopening. "You loved him," I said quietly. "It's hard to see the truth about people we love." Tears filled her eyes and she nodded. "I should have stood by you," she whispered, "not by his mistakes." There was a long, aching pause. Part of me wanted to retreat to protect the fortress I had built around my heart, but another part, a braver part, understood that real healing sometimes means letting the right people back in. "I appreciate you coming," I said, meaning it. She reached across the table, hesitating, then rested her hand lightly on mine. Her touch was tentative, like she didn't know if she was allowed anymore. For a long time, we just sat there. Two women connected not just by grief, but by love for someone who had failed both of us in different ways. It didn't erase everything. It didn't undo the years of hurt, but it was a start. Before she left, Eleanor pressed the tin of cookies into my hands. "I didn't know what else to bring," she said, managing a weak smile. "You always loved my oatmeal raisin." I laughed, a real laugh, surprising both of us. "Still do," I admitted as she walked down the steps and disappeared into the soft evening light. I felt something settle inside me. Not a perfect ending, not a full repair, but peace. Eleanor wasn't coming back into my life to fix the past. She wasn't asking me to forget. She was simply offering a hand, and this time, I was strong enough to decide how to accept it. I didn't need anyone's approval to stand tall anymore, but it turned out, standing tall didn't mean standing alone. Some bridges, it seemed, were worth crossing again. Not for them, but for me. Months passed each day, layering new moments over the old pain like fresh paint over weathered wood. Some days, the memories of my marriage brushed against me like a cold breeze I couldn't quite shake. Other days, I didn't think about Alexander at all. And slowly, without realizing exactly when it happened, the grief that had once consumed me shrank down to something I could carry without it breaking me. It was a crisp, cool afternoon when I finally returned to the seaside bench where Alexander and I used to sit during the early years of our marriage. It was one of those places etched into the background of 1,000 memories. A place where promises were once whispered under a setting sun, where laughter had once echoed into the salt, thick air. I hadn't come back to mourn. I hadn't come to cling to what was lost. I came because it was time to let go, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with grace. The ocean stretched out endlessly before me, restless and alive. Waves broke along the shore, pulling at the sand and smoothing away footprints left behind by strangers. Watching them, I understood something I hadn't been ready to accept until now. Nothing stays the same. Not the tide, not the land, not love. Change isn't betrayal. It's survival. I sat on the bench, wrapping my coat tighter against the breeze, and closed my eyes. I thought about the girl I had been when Alexander first said he loved me. Bright-eyed, trusting, full of dreams, she didn't know she would one day trade away, piece by piece. I thought about the woman who had wept on Catherine's couch, believing she had failed, believing she wasn't enough. And then I thought about the woman sitting here now, steady, scarred, but unbowed. I didn't need to pretend everything that happened was okay. It wasn't What Alexander did, what Vanessa did, it was cruel. It was selfish, but it didn't define me. Their betrayal said everything about who they were. My survival said everything about who I was, pulling my purse into my lap. I reached inside and found the item I had brought with me. My wedding ring. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the tiny engravings worn smooth. With time, I had kept it until now, unsure what to do with it. Part of me had been afraid that letting it go would somehow erase all the good parts of the life I had built with Alexander. The parts that were real even if he had turned away from them. But sitting there feeling the earth solid beneath me and the wind pulling at my hair, I realized something. Letting go doesn't erase the love I gave. It doesn't erase the loyalty, the sacrifices, the hope. It honors them, because I deserve to give those things to someone who cherished them. And most importantly, I deserve to give them to myself. With a small, steady breath, I stood up and walked to the edge of the water. The waves lapped against the shore, impatient and hungry. I looked at the ring. One last time whispered a soft goodbye, not to Alexander, but to the version of me who stayed too long for the wrong reasons and let it slip from my hand. It caught the light for just a moment, a tiny flash of gold against the blue, and then it was gone, swallowed by the sea. I stood there for a long while watching the horizon stretch wider and wider, until even the tightness in my chest began to ease. When I turned back toward the car, I didn't feel empty. I felt lighter. The past wasn't a chain around my ankles anymore. It was part of the story that had shaped me, but it wasn't the story that would define me. I had loved, I had lost, I had rebuilt, and now I was writing a new chapter, one not bound by broken promises or old wounds, one written by me, for me. As I walked away from the ocean and back toward my new life, I carried nothing but my own strength. 1 year after Alexander's funeral, I found myself on the terrace of a small cafe overlooking the town square. Spring had arrived early, coating the trees in tender green buds and scattering wildflowers across the public gardens. I sipped my coffee, savoring the warmth against the slight morning chill, and opened my laptop. The blank document stared back at me, intimidating but exhilarating. The first page of the book I had finally gathered the courage to write, not about Alexander. Not about betrayal, but about reclamation. The story of how women throughout history had rebuilt their lives after loss, creating something stronger from the ruins. The research had consumed me for months. Interviews with widows, divorcees, and women who had simply chosen to start again. Their voices echoed in my head as my fingers hovered over the keyboard, each story unique but connected by a common thread of resilience. Beginning again isn't surrender. I typed the first sentence flowing easily. It's the ultimate act of self-belief. As I wrote the square below, filled with people going about their morning routines, mothers pushing strollers, business people hurrying to meetings, elderly couples taking slow, deliberate walks, life continuing in its endless variations. I took another sip of coffee, feeling the sense of belonging that had gradually replaced my isolation. This town was mine now. In a way it hadn't been during my marriage. I had chosen to stay, not out of inertia or fear, but because I had reclaimed it, street by street, building by building, relationship by relationship. The house on Maple Street had been sold months ago. The proceeds divided between a comfortable investment portfolio and the foundation I had established in my name, a scholarship fund for women returning to education after significant life changes. The scholarship that would have once funded my abandoned graduate studies now supported others facing similar crossroads. Rebecca, I looked up to see Daniel Spencer, the owner of the local bookstore, approaching with a smile. In his hands was a package wrapped in brown paper. "Special delivery," he said, setting it on the table. "Just arrived this morning. I thought you might want it right away. Rather than waiting for our event tonight." I smiled, recognizing the shape. "The advance copies." He nodded. "Hot off the press." With careful fingers, I unwrapped the package to reveal my first published essay collection, Reclaiming Women's Stories of Rebuilding After Loss. My name embossed on the cover in simple, elegant lettering. Beneath it, a subtitle that had taken months to perfect. A lump formed in my throat as I traced the letters with my fingertip. This wasn't just a book. It was tangible proof of my transformation. "It's beautiful," Daniel said quietly, respectfully, giving me space to absorb the moment. "Thank you for bringing it," I replied, looking up to meet his warm gaze. "And for hosting the launch tonight. Wouldn't miss it." He smiled. "Half the town is coming. You've made quite an impact here this past year." After he left, I sat holding the book, thinking about all the invisible ways I had changed since that day in the funeral home. The outside transformations were obvious. The new haircut that framed my face. In a way, Alexander would never have approved of the wardrobe that reflected my preferences rather than his. The small tattoo on my wrist, inked 6 months after his death. A simple phoenix rising, but the internal shifts were more profound. The way I no longer flinched when making decisions without consulting anyone. The way my voice had found its natural register again, no longer softened to avoid taking up too much space. The way I moved through the world, not as someone's wife, but simply as myself, complete undefined by relationships unapologetically present. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Lunch today. Want to hear about the final scholarship selections." I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation Catherine had become the head of the selection committee for my foundation, bringing her sharp mind and compassionate understanding to the process. Our relationship had deepened over the year, transitioning from sister as rescuer to equal partners in building something meaningful. As I gathered my things to leave, I caught sight of a familiar figure across the square. Vanessa, nearly unrecognizable, in simple jeans and a plain sweater, her once immaculate hair pulled back in a careless ponytail. She was carrying a tray of coffees, likely for her new office job, at the insurance company. The only place that would hire her after the scandal surrounding Alexander's death and the ensuing legal battles had tarnished her reputation. Our eyes met briefly across the distance. This time there was no smirk, no arrogance in her gaze, just a flicker of recognition and then avoidance as she hurried away. I felt no triumph seeing her diminished, no vindictive pleasure in her downfall. If anything, I felt a strange kinship. We had both been shaped by the same man, both believed in versions of Alexander that weren't completely real. The difference was that I had found my way back to myself while she was still lost, in the aftermath of dreams that had never been hers to claim. I closed my laptop, tucked my new book carefully into my bag, and walked down the cafe steps into the sunshine. The town stretched before me, familiar streets now lined with possibilities instead of memories. I had appointments to keep a book launch, to prepare for a life that continued to unfold in directions I was now brave enough to explore. Alexander's death had not freed me. I had freed myself long before his heart gave out in that quiet moment when I decided my dignity was more valuable than his approval. Everything that followed the prenup, the funeral confrontation, the reclaiming of assets. Those were just the external manifestations of a liberation that had already taken root inside me. As I walked toward Catherine's office, my steps were light, unhurried. I passed the courthouse where the final papers had been signed months ago, the park where I had spent countless hours rebuilding my strength, through long solitary walks, the community center, where I now taught a weekly writing workshop for women finding their voices. Each landmark was a testament not just to survival, but to revival. Each represented a choice to move forward rather than circle the wreckage of what had been lost. The sun warmed my face as I rounded the corner, and I found myself smiling. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, but because I had learned that imperfection didn't mean failure. It meant I was fully alive, navigating a messy, beautiful reality on my own terms. The thing about reclaiming your life, I had written in the conclusion of my book, is that you don't return to who you were before the loss. You become someone new, someone who carries both the wounds and the wisdom, the grief and the growth forward into a future that belongs entirely to you. Walking through the town square that morning, surrounded by the life I had carefully constructed from the ruins of Betrayal, I felt those words resonate in every step. This was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of pain or memory, but the presence of choice, of agency, of fierce and tender self-possession. It wasn't the ending I had once imagined for myself. It was better, it was mine. My book launch that evening exceeded all expectations. The small bookstore overflowed with people friends I'd made since striking out on my own, former colleagues, curious about my transformation, women who had shared their stories for my research, and many I didn't recognize at all. Daniel had arranged the chairs in neat rows facing a small podium, with my books displayed prominently on a table draped in burgundy cloth. Catherine arrived early, bringing a bouquet of wildflowers. "For the author," she said with a proud smile, handing them to me. "I always knew you had this in you. Did you?" I asked, arranging the flowers in a vase Daniel had provided. "Because I certainly didn't." "Of course I did," she replied. "Even when we were kids, you were the one writing stories in those little notebooks Mom bought you. Remember how you used to read them to me before bed? Stories about women explorers and scientists and queens." The memories surfaced slowly. Spiral notebooks filled with my childish handwriting, the flashlight under the covers. Catherine's eager face as I whispered adventures of heroines who conquered worlds I had forgotten. Those early dreams, buried them beneath the expectations of adulthood and marriage. "I'd forgotten that," I admitted. "Well, I didn't," Catherine said, straightening my collar. "Alexander may have dimmed your light for a while, but he never extinguished it. That's what he never understood." As people filled the bookstore, I found myself oddly calm. Public speaking had terrified me during my marriage. Alexander always spoke for us at gatherings, always took the lead, while I nodded supportively. But standing before this crowd felt natural, necessary even. When Daniel introduced me, calling me a voice for women reclaiming their power, I approached the podium with steady steps. I looked out at the sea of faces, expecting nervousness to overtake me. Instead, I felt a profound sense of belonging. "Thank you all for coming tonight." I began, my voice clear and unwavering. "This book began as a personal journey, a way to make sense of my own experience. But as I spoke with women across the country, some who had lost partners to death, others to betrayal, still others who had simply woken up one day to realize they had lost themselves, I realized this story is larger than any one person. I read a passage from the introduction, then opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up immediately. One woman, perhaps in her 60s, stood shakily. "I've been married for 42 years. She said, "I don't even know who I am outside of being Harold's wife anymore." How do you start to find yourself when you've been someone's extension for so long? The room quieted the question. Hanging in the air like a confession, I recognized in her face the same fear that had once paralyzed me. The terror of the unknown, of identity without attachment of value, without validation. "You start small," I said gently. "You ask yourself simple questions. What do I like to eat when no one else is choosing the restaurant? What color makes me happy when I don't have to consider someone else's preferences? What dream did I set aside so long ago that I've almost forgotten it existed?" I watched her nod, tears brimming in her eyes. "And then," I continued, "you do something terrifying. You answer those questions honestly, even if the answers surprise you, even if they don't fit neatly into the life you've built. Because finding yourself isn't about grand gestures. It's about reclaiming little pieces of your truth, until suddenly you recognize the person in the mirror again." The evening continued with similar exchanges, women sharing their stories, asking questions that felt like lifelines thrown into deep water. By the time I signed the last book, my hand ached and my heart felt fuller than it had in years. As Daniel locked the bookstore behind the last guests, he turned to me with admiration. "You've started something important here," he said. "Those women tonight, they needed to hear that someone survived what they're facing." I nodded, gathering my things. "I needed to hear it too, once." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to get coffee sometime? Not as a bookseller and author, just as people." The invitation caught me off guard. Daniel was attractive in an understated way, intelligent eyes behind simple glasses, a quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself. During the past year of regular visits to his bookstore, I'd grown to appreciate his thoughtful book recommendations and genuine interest in my writing process. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself with how easily the acceptance came. Not from loneliness or need, but from a place of genuine interest. "How about Wednesday?" Walking home that night, I felt a curious lightness. Not the frantic euphoria that comes with escaping pain, but something steadier, the quiet satisfaction of building a life on my own terms, brick by solid brick. The foundation work had become my unexpected passion over the past year. What began as a simple scholarship program had evolved into a comprehensive support system for women in transition, offering not just financial assistance for education, but mentoring, housing assistance, and community. 3 mornings a week, I worked from a small office downtown, reviewing applications, meeting with potential partners, developing programs. The other days I dedicated to my writing and to myself. The balance felt right, sustainable in a way my previous life had never been. My phone buzzed as I approached my apartment, a text from Eleanor. "Just heard about your successful book launch from Jeannie Watson. So proud of you, dear. When you have time, I'd love a signed copy." My relationship with Alexander's mother had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. After our initial reconciliation, we began meeting monthly for lunch. Our conversations were tentative at first, carefully navigating around the grief we both carried in different ways. Over time, Eleanor revealed aspects of Alexander. I had never known his childhood struggles with his father's expectations, the panic attacks he had hidden from everyone during his 20s, the profound insecurity beneath his confident exterior. These revelations didn't excuse his betrayal, but they helped me understand the complexities that had shaped him. I failed him. Eleanor confessed during one lunch. I taught him that appearance matters more than honesty, that success is measured in acquisitions rather than connections. I never showed him how to be vulnerable. We all failed in different ways. I replied not to absolve him, but to acknowledge the intricate web of choices and circumstances that create a life. As spring deepened into summer, my days found a rhythm that honored both productivity and peace. I worked on my second book, exploring how women throughout history had reinvented themselves after significant losses while continuing to expand the foundation's reach. The coffee with Daniel evolved into dinner, which evolved into regular hikes along the coastal trails, which evolved into comfortable silences shared over books in his apartment or mine. We moved slowly, deliberately, both of us carrying past experiences that had taught us caution. I was engaged once, he told me one evening as we sat on my balcony watching the sunset. To my college girlfriend, she left 2 months before the wedding, said she couldn't picture the next 50 years with me. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. He shrugged. It was 15 years ago, but it taught me something important, that love shouldn't be a prison or a performance. It should be a choice you make every morning when you wake up next to someone. I nodded, understanding completely. A conscious decision, not just momentum. Exactly. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but assured. That's what I appreciate about how we're doing this. Eyes wide open, no fantasy, just two people choosing each other's company, day by day. His perspective matched mine perfectly. Not a desperate cleaving born from fear of loneliness, but a gradual coming together of two whole individuals who enhanced rather than completed each other. As summer waned, I received an unexpected invitation, a speaking opportunity at a women's conference in Chicago. The topic, reclaiming your identity after loss. The email mentioned that they had read my book and believed my perspective would resonate with their audience. Catherine insisted on helping me prepare. This could open doors for the foundation. She pointed out as we reviewed my presentation, think of the connections you could make, the support we could generate for the scholarship program. She was right, of course. The practical benefits were considerable, but as I practiced my speech in front of her living room mirror, I realized this opportunity meant something deeper as well. A chance to transform my private pain into public purpose. The conference coincided with what would have been my 20th anniversary with Alexander. I hadn't realized this until I was packing my suitcase, and the date suddenly hit me with unexpected force. For a moment, grief washed over me, not for the man he became, but for the dreams we had once shared, for the years invested for the future I had once imagined. I sat on the edge of the bed, allowing myself to feel the sadness without drowning in it. This too was part of healing, acknowledging the loss without letting it define my present. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Daniel. Just calling to wish you luck tomorrow, he said. Though you don't need it, you're going to be amazing. Thank you. I replied, his confidence in me a warm counterpoint to my momentary melancholy. I was just having a moment. Actually, tomorrow would have been my 20th anniversary. He was quiet for a moment. Would you like me to distract you with funny bookstore customer stories? Or would you prefer to sit with that feeling for a while? His question, the way he offered presence without pressure, support, without suffocation, reminded me how far I had come in my expectations of partnership. Tell me a bookstore story, I said, smiling despite myself. The one about the woman who wanted a book with a blue cover but couldn't remember the title or author, As he launched into the familiar anecdote, I finished packing the weight of the anniversary date still present, but no longer overwhelming. This was another gift of my reclaimed life, the ability to hold contradictory emotions simultaneously, to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. Chicago welcomed me with architectural grandeur and brisk autumn winds. The conference center bustled with women from across the country, entrepreneurs, academics, artists, mothers, all seeking connection and growth. My session was scheduled for the second day, giving me time to attend other presentations and network with potential foundation partners. After checking into my hotel, I decided to explore the surrounding neighborhood. Walking helped me process thoughts, prepare mentally. As I turned a corner, a familiar profile stopped me in my tracks. A tall man with broad shoulders and salt and pepper hair stood at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. For a disorienting moment, my heart lurched, Alexander. But of course, it wasn't him. Couldn't be him. Just a stranger with a similar build, similar stance. The split second of confusion passed, but left a lingering unease. Even now, a year after his death, my body remembered him, reacted to the ghost of his presence. I changed direction, choosing another route for my walk. By the time I returned to the hotel, I had regained my equilibrium. I spent the evening reviewing my presentation notes and FaceTiming with Daniel, who showed me his latest bookstore acquisition, a rare first edition he'd been hunting for months. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a deep green suit that I had chosen for myself not to please anyone else's eye. As I applied minimal makeup and styled my hair, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me had Alexander's betrayal written into the fine lines around her eyes, but also resilience etched into the determined set of her jaw. The conference room was larger than I expected, filled to capacity with perhaps 300 women. As the moderator introduced me, highlighting the impact of my book and the work of my foundation, I took a deep, centering breath. Rebecca Walsh experienced the kind of loss that reshapes a life, she said, and then did what so many of us struggle to do. She used that reshaping as an opportunity to reclaim her authentic self. Please welcome her to share her journey of reclamation. The applause carried me to the podium. I looked out at the sea of faces, some eager, some skeptical, all searching for something that might illuminate their own paths. The responsibility of that moment pressed on me, but it no longer crushed me, as it once would have. Reclamation. I began, is a word we often associate with land taking back territory that was once yours but became somehow lost or overrun. I chose this word deliberately for my book, because that's exactly how I experienced my journey back to myself after betrayal and loss, as territory that had always been mine, but that I had allowed others to occupy, until I barely recognized it as my own. For the next hour, I shared my story, not with self-pity or vindictiveness, but as a map for others who found themselves similarly displaced within their own lives. I spoke about the subtle erosion of identity that happens in dysfunctional relationships, the warning signs I had ignored the moment of awakening that came not with a bang, but with a quiet realization of my own worth, the hardest truth I had to face. I told them, wasn't that my husband had betrayed me. It was that I had betrayed myself by accepting less than I deserved, by shrinking to fit into spaces that were too small for my spirit, by believing that love required diminishment rather than expansion. I saw nodding heads, tissues being passed, notes being taken. But it was the questions afterward that revealed how deeply the message had resonated. Women lined up behind microphones placed throughout the room, each sharing a piece of their own story before asking for guidance. My husband died last year after 30 years of marriage. One woman said, her voice trembling. I've spent my whole adult life as part of a pair. How do I learn to be just me again? I'm afraid of being alone more than I'm afraid of staying in my unhappy marriage. Admitted another, how did you overcome that fear? What do you do with the anger? Asked a third. I'm so angry at my ex-husband, but also at myself for allowing the situation for so long. I answered each question thoughtfully, drawing not just from my experience, but from the collective wisdom of all the women I had interviewed for my book. I didn't offer easy solutions or platitudes, but practical steps and permission to struggle through the process. When the session ended, women surrounded the stage, waiting to speak with me personally. For nearly 2 hours, I listened to snippets of their stories, signed books, exchanged contact information with those interested in the foundation. By the time the conference center staff began setting up for the next event, I was emotionally drained but profoundly fulfilled. That evening alone in my hotel room, I kicked off my shoes and ordered room service, a luxury I would never have considered during my marriage when Alexander deemed room service wastefully extravagant. I savored every bite of my overpriced pasta, every moment of solitude after the day's intensity. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. How did it go? I smiled, typing back. Better than I could have imagined, exhausting, but right. Proud of you. He replied, not surprised though. As I prepared for bed, my phone rang again. An unknown Chicago number. Curious, I answered. Rebecca Walsh. The voice was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. Yes, this is she. It's Michael Harrington, Alexander's old business partner. I was at your presentation today. I sat down abruptly on the edge of the bed. Surprised I remembered Michael well, a frequent guest at our dinner parties. Always with a different girlfriend. Always with a slick story about their latest business acquisition. He had been Alexander's friend, more than mine, had sided with him completely during our separation. Michael Huadar, I said, keeping my tone neutral. This is unexpected. I know. He replied, sounding uncharacteristically subdued. I wasn't planning to attend the conference. My sister dragged me along to support her. But when I saw your name in the program... He paused. I need to apologize to you for what specifically I wasn't being difficult, intentionally, but I needed clarity. Michael had been involved in so many aspects of our lives, had witnessed so much of the deterioration, for not speaking up when I saw what was happening with Vanessa, for playing along when Alexander started bringing her to events, for God for a lot of things. He sounded genuinely remorseful. Your talk today, it made me see how complicit I was in something really destructive. I let his words settle between us, not rushing to absolve him. Thank you for telling me that, I said finally. There's something else. He said, something you should probably know. Alexander wasn't the company, wasn't as solid as everyone thought. He had made some risky investments, taken out loans using company assets as collateral. When he died, it all started unraveling. This was new information, though perhaps not entirely surprising. Alexander's ambition had always outpaced his caution. Is that why Vanessa got nothing in the end? Not just the prenup, but because there was nothing left. Basically, Michael confirmed. The prenup protected you from his debts, thankfully. But the empire he was building with her, the future he promised her, it was mostly smoke and mirrors. He was desperate those last few months, taking bigger and bigger risks. The revelation settled over me like a final puzzle piece clicking into place. Alexander's distraction, his increasing absences, the way he had clung to Vanessa's admiration as everything else began to crumble. Not that it excused his betrayal, but it painted a more complex picture of his final days. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Michael was quiet for a moment. "Because I think you deserve to know that leaving him wasn't just the right choice, emotionally. It probably saved you financially as well. And because your speech today made me realize how many people get hurt when we all stay silent about things we know are wrong." After we hung up, I sat for a long time processing this new information. It didn't change the past, didn't erase the pain of betrayal or the struggle of rebuilding, but it confirmed what I had slowly come to understand over the past year, that reclaiming my life had been an act not just of emotional self-preservation, but of profound self-respect. I slept deeply that night without dreams or disturbances. In the morning, I packed my suitcase feeling lighter somehow, as if Michael's revelation had removed a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged was still there. The lingering doubt that perhaps I had abandoned a marriage that could have been saved, that perhaps Alexander's choices were somehow a reflection of my inadequacies. The conference's final day included a networking lunch, where I connected with directors of similar foundations across the country. By the time I boarded my flight home that evening, I had invitations to speak at 3 more events and potential partnerships that could expand our scholarship program nationally. Catherine picked me up from the airport, eager for details. As we drove through the quiet evening streets, I shared the conference highlights, the unexpected conversation with Michael, the possibilities that were unfolding. "So basically, you're becoming the face of a movement," she said, glancing at me with pride. I laughed. "Hardly, but maybe a voice in a conversation that needs to be happening. You know what this means, don't you?" she asked as we pulled into her driveway. "We're going to need a bigger office, more staff. This is growing beyond what the 2 of us can handle ourselves." She was right. What had begun as a personal healing project was evolving into something with momentum of its own. The thought was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. Leadership had never been a role I sought in my marriage. I had been content to follow Alexander's lead to support, rather than direct. "You can do this," Catherine said, reading my hesitation. "You're not the same person who left that house a year ago." Back in my apartment, I found a small package leaning against my door, a book-shaped gift wrapped in simple brown paper, with a note from Daniel. "For when you returned, thought you might find this interesting." Inside was a rare edition of essays by women writers from the 1920s. Their words radical for their time, still resonant today. On the inside cover, Daniel had written, "Voices that refuse to be silenced like yours. Welcome home." The thoughtfulness of the gift, the way he had chosen, something that spoke to my intellectual interests, rather than making a more conventionally romantic gesture, touched me deeply. It reflected an understanding of who I was becoming, not just who I had been or what I had survived. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. True to Catherine's prediction, the foundation expanded rapidly. We hired an administrative assistant and a program coordinator. We moved from our small office to a more spacious location downtown that could accommodate counseling sessions and support groups in addition to our administrative work. Between foundation responsibilities, speaking engagements, and work on my second book, I barely had time to process the transformation of my daily life. The woman who had once organized her schedule around her husband's needs and preferences now found herself making decisions that affected an entire organization and the women it served. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I found myself in the new office after everyone else had left. Rain tapped against the windows as I reviewed applications for our next scholarship cycle. The stories in these applications never failed to move me. Women overcoming enormous obstacles to reclaim their education, their careers, their sense of possibility. A gentle knock interrupted my concentration. I looked up to see Daniel in the doorway, raindrops glistening in his hair, holding a paper bag that smelled tantalizingly of Thai food. "I thought you might be forgetting to eat again," he said, setting the bag on my desk. "Catherine mentioned you've been here since 7 this morning." The gesture, thoughtful without being intrusive, exemplified how our relationship had developed over the past months. We moved in each other's lives easily, supporting, without smothering, caring, without controlling. "You're a lifesaver," I said, suddenly aware of my hunger. "Join me." We spread the containers across my desk using manuscript pages as makeshift placemats. As we ate, Daniel filled me in on his day at the bookstore, the eccentric customers, the new shipment of first editions he was cataloging. I told him about the scholarship applications, the upcoming board meeting, the chapter I was struggling to complete for my new book. There was an ease between us that I had never experienced with Alexander, a natural rhythm of give and take of interest, genuinely offered and received. When he reached across the desk to wipe a spot of sauce from my chin, the simple intimacy of the gesture nearly undid me. "What is it?" he asked, noticing my sudden emotion. "I'm just happy," I said, the simplicity of the statement belying its significance. I didn't know I could feel this way again. Or maybe I never did not really. He nodded, understanding. It's different when it's built on honesty from the beginning, when there's nothing to prove and no one to impress. As autumn deepened toward winter, memories of the previous year's pain began to surface. The anniversary of leaving Alexander, of finding the prenup, of all the small and large reckonings that had followed. But now these memories came without the sharp sting of fresh grief, more like echoes of a storm that had passed. The foundation continued to grow, gaining recognition beyond our local community. A national women's magazine ran a feature on our work, highlighting the stories of several scholarship recipients. Donations increased, allowing us to expand our programs to include childcare stipends and transportation assistance. I found myself increasingly comfortable in my role as advocate and leader, discovering strengths I hadn't known I possessed: the ability to speak persuasively to donors, to navigate complex organizational challenges, to hold space for others' grief, while maintaining professional boundaries. My relationship with Daniel evolved with the same careful intention that characterized everything in my new life. We spent weekends exploring coastal towns, evenings discussing books and politics, quiet mornings sharing coffee and companionable silence. He respected my independence even as we grew closer, never assuming ownership of my time or decisions. 10 months after our first coffee date, during a weekend trip to a small bed and breakfast in wine country, Daniel asked if I would consider moving in together, not because it's expected or because it's the next logical step. He clarified as we sat on the inn's back porch, watching the sunset over vineyards. But because I love the life we're creating together, and I think we could create an even richer one under the same roof. I didn't answer immediately. The prospect filled me with both warmth and wariness, the memory of how easily I had lost myself in my previous cohabitation, still fresh, despite the healing that had occurred. "I need to think about it," I said honestly, not because I don't want to, but because I want to be sure I'm doing it for the right reasons. He squeezed my hand. "Take all the time you need. There's no rush." That night I lay awake beside him, considering the difference between this decision and the many life-altering choices I had made during my marriage. Then I had acted from fear of disapproval, from a desperate desire to keep peace at any cost, from a fundamental belief that my needs mattered less than Alexander's. Now I had the freedom to choose from strength rather than weakness, from clarity rather than confusion. I could say yes because I wanted to, not because I feared the consequences of saying no. In the morning over coffee on the same porch, I gave Daniel my answer. "Yes," I said, "but with a condition." "Name it," he replied. "I keep my apartment at least for a while. Not because I plan to use it, but because having it represents something important to me. The knowledge that I can stand on my own, that I'm choosing this rather than needing it." He nodded, understanding immediately. "That makes perfect sense to me." By the time the new year arrived, we had combined our households, his books merging with mine, on expanded shelves, his coffee maker finding a home beside my tea kettle, our lives intertwining with deliberate care. We established routines that honored both togetherness and solitude, creating a relationship unlike any I had known before, founded on mutual respect rather than mutual dependency. Spring marked the 2nd anniversary of Alexander's death. I visited the cemetery for the first time since the funeral, bringing a simple arrangement of daisies flowers with no particular significance to our relationship, nothing weighted with memories or meaning. The gravestone was elegant but understated, bearing only his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Son." I stood there feeling strangely detached, as if visiting the resting place of someone I had known in another lifetime. "I hope you found peace," I said quietly, not because I believed he could hear me, but because the words needed to be spoken. "I have." As I turned to leave, I noticed a figure standing by a nearby grave. Eleanor, her silver hair blowing gently in the spring breeze. Our eyes met across the neat rows of headstones, and after a moment's hesitation, she walked toward me. "I thought I might find you here today," she said, her voice soft. "I come every week, but today felt significant somehow. 2 years. I nodded. "It seems impossible, doesn't it? Both so long ago and just yesterday." We walked slowly back toward the cemetery gates, falling into the comfortable rhythm we had established during our regular lunches. Eleanor looked older than when I had first reconnected with her, more fragile physically, but there was a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I wanted to tell you," she said, as we reached her car. "I'm selling the house. It's too big for just me, and it holds too many memories. Some good, some difficult." I squeezed her arm gently. "That's a big decision. I've found a small cottage near the coast," she continued. "It has a garden and a view of the water. I think I might try painting again. I used to, before I married Alexander's father." The revelation surprised me in all our conversations. Eleanor had never mentioned being an artist. "You painted Alexander, never told me that." "He didn't know," she said with a sad smile. "My husband didn't approve of frivolous pursuits, so I packed away my supplies before Alexander was born. It's one of my greatest regrets that I never showed my son. It was possible to pursue passion alongside practicality." We stood there in the gentle spring sunshine, 2 women connected by a man who had shaped both our lives, now finding our own paths forward in his absence. "Would you like to see the cottage before I finalize the purchase?" Eleanor asked. "I value your opinion." "I'd be honored," I replied, touched by this new dimension of our evolving relationship. The following weekend, I drove Eleanor to the coastal property, a stone cottage set back from a quiet road with windows that captured the ocean light and a wild garden that tumbled toward the shore. Though small, it had a timeless charm that suited Eleanor perfectly. "It needs work," she admitted as we walked through rooms that smelled of salt air and neglect. "But I can see its potential. I could see it too. Not just the cottage's physical possibilities, but what it represented for Eleanor, a reclamation, similar to my own, a late-life declaration of independence and self-discovery. It's perfect for you," I said, watching her trace the light patterns on the worn wooden floor. "I can absolutely picture you painting by that north window." Her eyes glistened. "Do you think it's foolish, starting something new at my age?" "I think it's brave," I replied, "and necessary." Over the following months, Eleanor's cottage renovation became a project that drew us closer. I helped her choose paint colors, accompanied her to estate sales for furniture, spent weekends helping her establish the garden. Daniel often joined us, his practical knowledge of carpentry proving invaluable as we restored the cottage's ancient woodwork. This is the mother-in-law relationship I always hoped for. Eleanor confessed one afternoon as we planted lavender along the stone path leading to her door. "Just decades later than expected." I laughed, but I understood what she meant. There was an ease between us now that had never existed during my marriage. A friendship based on mutual respect rather than obligatory family ties. By midsummer, Eleanor had moved into the cottage and set up a modest painting studio in the sunroom overlooking the sea. I gave her a housewarming gift of professional quality watercolors and brushes, which she accepted with tears and determination. "I may be terrible after all these years," she warned. "Then be terrible gloriously," I replied, echoing advice I had given so many women through the foundation. "The joy is in the doing, not the result." Meanwhile, the foundation continued to flourish. We awarded 20 scholarships that year, twice our previous number. Our support groups expanded to include not just women rebuilding after relationship loss, but those reclaiming themselves after career setbacks, health crises, and other life transitions. My second book, now nearing completion, had evolved beyond my initial concept. Rather than focusing solely on women recovering from betrayal, it explored the broader theme of reclamation across various forms of loss, telling stories of women who had rebuilt after losing careers, health, loved ones, financial security, and sense of purpose. The through line is resilience. I explained to my editor during a video call. Not the romanticized version that suggests suffering is somehow ennobling, but the practical day-by-day rebuilding that happens when women refuse to be defined by what they've lost. The manuscript was due in September, giving me a tight deadline for final revisions. Daniel respected my need for uninterrupted writing time, creating a sanctuary in our shared home where I could immerse myself in the work. He fielded calls, handled domestic matters, and kept me supplied with tea and encouragement during long writing sessions. One evening, emerging bleary-eyed from the manuscript after a 12-hour stretch, I found him in the kitchen preparing dinner, jazz playing softly in the background. "You didn't have to do this," I said, wrapping my arms around him from behind. "I wanted to," he replied, turning to kiss my forehead. "Besides, it's a celebration. I heard from Catherine that the Matthews Foundation is matching donations for the scholarship fund. Double the money, double the impact." The news was extraordinary. The Matthews Foundation was one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the region. Their matching grant would transform what we could accomplish. "How did this happen?" I asked, stunned. We've been trying to get on their radar for months." Daniel smiled mysteriously. "Check your email." In my inbox was a message from Eleanor sent hours earlier. "Dearest Rebecca, I hope you won't be upset with me for taking matters into my own hands. James Matthews was an old friend of my husband's. I invited him to tea last week and showed him some of the Foundation's materials. I also showed him the early chapters of your new book that you shared with me." James was deeply moved. His own daughter went through a similar experience years ago and never fully recovered her sense of self. He sees in your work the support she never received. The matching grant is confirmed. Perhaps this is my small way of making amends, using the old connections that once served Alexander's ambitions to instead support the important work you're doing. With love and admiration, Eleanor. Tears filled my eyes as I read her words. The Eleanor I had first met, the woman who had defended her son unconditionally, who had viewed me with suspicion and judgment during our separation, would never have imagined taking such an action. Her transformation mirrored my own in so many ways. "This changes everything," I said, turning back to Daniel. "We can expand the emergency housing assistance offer, childcare stipends, maybe even establish a mentoring program." He nodded, understanding the significance. "And it validates what you've been building. This isn't just a personal passion project anymore. It's a recognized force for change." That night, as we sat on our balcony watching stars emerge above the city lights, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not that my journey was finished. There would always be new challenges, new growth, new understanding, but that this cycle of reclamation had come full circle. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, his voice thoughtful in the darkness, "about that apartment you kept." "What about it?" I asked. The small studio had remained empty since I moved in with him, a safety net I hadn't needed, but couldn't quite relinquish. What if we converted it into temporary housing for women in the scholarship program? Those who need a stable place while getting back on their feet. The suggestion was perfect, transforming a symbol of my self-protection into a space that could offer the same security to others. That's brilliant," I said, squeezing his hand. "It would need some work furnishings, but it would give someone else the fresh start you found," he finished. The next morning, I called Catherine to share the idea. She embraced it immediately, already thinking of a current scholarship recipient who was struggling with housing insecurity while completing her nursing degree. "This is exactly what Meredith needs," Catherine said, referring to the young mother of two who had left an abusive relationship to pursue her education. A safe place for a few months while she completes her clinical rotations. Within weeks, we had transformed my small apartment, painting the walls in warm colors, furnishing it with comfortable basics, stocking the kitchen with essentials. The day Meredith and her children moved in, I handed over the keys with a sense of rightness that confirmed I no longer needed this particular safety net. "I can't thank you enough," Meredith said, her children exploring the apartment with excitement. "This changes everything for us." "I know exactly what you mean," I replied, recognizing in her eyes the same determination I had felt during my own rebuilding. As fall approached, I delivered my completed manuscript to my editor and turned my attention to expanding the Foundation's programs using the Matthews Grant. We hired 2 more staff members, established a formal mentoring network, and developed a financial literacy curriculum specifically for women in transition. My speaking engagements now took me across the country, sometimes internationally. I found myself addressing audiences of hundreds, sharing not just my personal story, but the collective wisdom gathered from all the women I had interviewed. counseled and supported. During a conference in London, I received an unexpected email from Vanessa. Rebecca. It began simply, "I've hesitated to write this for months, unsure if you would even read a message from me. But after seeing your interview in The Guardian, I felt compelled to reach out. I want to apologize, not to make excuses or seek forgiveness, but because acknowledging the harm I participated in seems necessary for my own healing. I was selfish, callous, and incredibly immature. I viewed you as an obstacle rather than a person with feelings and a history I was helping to destroy. The past 2 years have been a harsh education." After Alexander's death and the financial collapse that followed, I lost everything. Not just material possessions, but my sense of identity and worth. It's taken intensive therapy and brutal self-examination to recognize how empty I was, how desperately I sought validation through men like Alexander. I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know that your work is reaching people you might never have imagined it would, even those who once stood on the other side of your pain. Vanessa. I stared at my screen, unsure how to feel. There was a time when such a message would have reignited my anger, my hurt. But now, 2 years removed from the raw wound of betrayal, I felt something unexpected, a calm acknowledgement of our shared humanity. After careful consideration, I replied, "Vanessa, thank you for your message. Healing is rarely a straight line, and it often requires facing difficult truths about ourselves and our choices. I appreciate your courage in reaching out. I don't harbor anger toward you anymore. That's not because what happened didn't matter, but because I've chosen to direct my energy toward building rather than burning. I wish you well on your continuing journey." Rebecca, it was brief as honest, neither absolving nor accusatory. I didn't share the exchange with anyone, not even Daniel. It felt like a private closing of a chapter, a quiet acknowledgement that even the deepest wounds eventually scar over and lose their power to define us. Returning home from London, I found our apartment filled with the scent of fresh flowers and baking bread. Daniel had prepared a welcome home dinner complete with candles and wine glasses that caught the evening light. "What's the occasion?" I asked, dropping my suitcase and falling gratefully into his embrace. 2 years, he said simply. 2 years, since our first coffee date. He explained, leading me to the table. "Though I'd been watching you in the bookstore for months before I worked up the courage to suggest it." I laughed. "You never told me that. You were intimidating," he admitted with a smile. "This beautiful, intense woman who came in every Saturday morning to browse the classics section. Always polite, but with this quiet sadness I couldn't quite place. Until your book came out and suddenly, everything made sense. And now?" I asked, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "Now you're still beautiful and intense," he said, "but the sadness has been replaced with something luminous, like you're fully present in your own life." The observation struck me deeply, precisely capturing the transformation I had experienced. "That's exactly how it feels," I said, "like I'm finally inhabiting my own existence instead of orbiting someone else's." After dinner, as we settled on the couch with cups of tea, Daniel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. My heart stuttered, not with apprehension, but with surprise. "This isn't what you think," he said, quickly reading my expression. "Or maybe it is, but not in the traditional sense." He opened the box to reveal not a ring, but a delicate silver key on a simple chain. "It's symbolic." He explained, a key to our shared life, but also a reminder that you always have access to your own separate space, your own identity, your own choices. I don't want to make you mine. I want to continue building something together where we both remain fully ourselves. Tears filled my eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. How perfectly it encapsulated what I valued most about our relationship. "It's perfect," I whispered, turning so he could fasten the necklace around my throat. The silver key rested just above my heart, catching the warm light from the table lamp. Not a shackle, not a claim, but a symbol of chosen connection, of doors opened rather than closed. As winter settled over the city, bringing early darkness and crystalline cold, I found myself reflecting on the approaching new year. What would be the third year of my reclaimed life? The foundation was thriving. My second book was in final production. My relationship with Daniel continued to deepen without consuming my identity. Eleanor had completed her first series of paintings, small luminous watercolors of the changing sea, and was planning a modest exhibition at a local gallery. She had become not just a link to my past, but a vital part of my present. A friend whose late-life reinvention inspired my own continuing evolution. My relationship with Catherine had matured from the urgent closeness of crisis into a balanced partnership, both personal and professional. She had begun dating again recently, a widowed professor she met through the Foundation's lecture series, and was experiencing her own quiet renaissance. Even my parents, initially bewildered by the dramatic changes in my life, had come to understand and support my transformation. My father, who had once advised me to work things out with Alexander, even after discovering his betrayal now, proudly shared articles about the Foundation with his friend. In early December, I received an unexpected invitation, a letter on heavy cream stationery requesting my participation in a documentary series about women who had reinvented their lives after significant setbacks. The producer, an award-winning filmmaker known for nuanced portrayals of complex social issues, wanted to feature both my personal story and the work of the Foundation. I discussed the opportunity with Daniel, with Catherine, with Eleanor. All encouraged me to accept seeing the potential to reach women who might never read my books or attend my lectures. Your story deserves the widest possible audience. Catherine insisted. Think of how many women are sitting in their kitchens right now, feeling trapped, feeling invisible, not knowing. Change is possible. After careful consideration, I agreed to the project. The filming would take place over several months, documenting not just my journey, but the impact of the Foundation's work on scholarship, recipients, and support group participants. The documentary team arrived in January. A director, camera person, sound technician, and producer. They filmed interviews where I recounted my marriage, the slow erosion of self, the shocking betrayal and the gradual reclaiming of my identity. They captured Foundation events, board meetings, scholarship award ceremonies. Most powerfully, they recorded conversations with women whose lives had been transformed through the programs we offered women like Meredith, now completing her nursing degree while living in what had once been my emergency escape apartment. Before I found the Foundation, I thought my only options were to stay in a destructive relationship or struggle alone. She told the interviewer her children playing quietly in the background. Rebecca and the team showed me there was a third path, one where I could rebuild with support where my dreams still mattered. The filming process was emotionally demanding but cathartic. Articulating my journey for the camera helped me recognize how far I had come, how completely I had transformed the raw material of betrayal into a purposeful new life. One afternoon, as the crew packed up after filming a support group session, the director pulled me aside. "There's something powerful happening here that I'm not sure you can see from the inside," she said. "You're not just helping women recover from specific losses. You're challenging the entire narrative about what happens to women after traditional sources of identity, marriage, motherhood, youth are disrupted." Her observation resonated deeply. While I had focused on practical support and personal recovery, the Foundation's work had indeed evolved into something more revolutionary, a reimagining of women's lives beyond conventional frameworks of value and success. As winter yielded to early spring, my second book was published to critical acclaim and strong sales. The documentary was in final editing, scheduled to premiere at a prestigious film festival in the fall. The Foundation had expanded to 3 full-time staff members plus volunteers, serving over 100 women annually through various programs. Daniel and I had settled into a rhythm that honored both our connection and our independence. He continued running the bookstore, now featuring regular author events and writing workshops. I divided my time between Foundation work writing and speaking engagements with dedicated space for our relationship at the center of this busy life. One mild March evening, as we walked along the harbor after dinner at a favorite restaurant, Daniel stopped to watch the boats gently rocking at their moorings. "I've been thinking about the bookstore," he said, his expression thoughtful. "About its future." "What about it?" I asked, leaning against the railing beside him. "I'm considering expanding, adding a dedicated space for writing workshops, maybe a small cafe, creating more of a community hub than just a place to buy books." The excitement in his voice was contagious. "That sounds perfect for you," I said, understanding his vision immediately. "Your strengths have always been in connecting people, creating spaces where ideas can flourish." He nodded, turning to face me fully. "I'd need to take out a loan, invest significant time in the renovation. It would be a major commitment." "You should do it," I said without hesitation, "even though it might mean less flexibility for us. Less time together, at least during the initial phase." I reached for his hand, touched by his consideration, but certain of my response. "Daniel, one of the things I value most about us is that we encourage each other's growth. We don't hold each other back from becoming more fully ourselves." He smiled, relief and gratitude in his eyes. That's exactly what I needed to hear. As we continued our walk, I reflected on how different this exchange was from similar conversations in my marriage. Alexander had pursued his ambitions, assuming I would adapt accordingly, never truly consulting me, never considering how his choices might impact my own dreams. Daniel's approach, honest, considerate, collaborative, exemplified the partnership I had once thought impossible. The following week, I traveled to Eleanor's coastal cottage for her art exhibition opening. The small local gallery had been transformed by her paintings, 20 watercolors capturing the changing moods of the sea through seasons and weather. "They're extraordinary," I said, genuinely moved by the sensitivity of her work. The paintings revealed a depth of observation and emotion I had never associated with my former mother-in-law during all the years of our earlier relationship. "Do you think so?" she asked, nervous, despite the small crowd of admirers already gathering around her work. I feel like an imposter starting so late, presenting myself as an artist after all these years. "That's exactly why they're compelling," I assured her. "Their mature work informed by decades of seeing, feeling, absorbing the world, even when you weren't expressing it on paper." By the end of the evening, Eleanor had sold 15 paintings and received a commission for 6 more. The gallery owner, impressed by both the quality of the work and the response, offered her a second exhibition in the fall. "I never imagined this," she confessed as we sat on her porch later that night, wrapped in blankets against the coastal chill. When Alexander's father forbade my painting, I believed that part of me was gone forever. I never realized it was just dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. I reached over to squeeze her hand, understanding completely. Some parts of ourselves are more resilient than we know. They can survive decades of neglect, still ready to flourish when finally given light and care. Like your writing, she observed, like the foundation, like both of us, I replied. Returning home from Eleanor's exhibition, I found an unexpected package waiting in our mailbox, advance copies of the documentary DVD titled Reclaiming Women's Journeys of Restoration. Along with it was a note from the director, explaining that the film had been accepted for screening at 3 major festivals and would air on public television later in the year. Daniel and I watched it together that evening, my hand clutching his as my story unfolded on screen. The filmmakers had created something remarkably nuanced, portraying not just the pain of betrayal, but the complex process of rebuilding that followed. Most moving were the sections featuring other women connected to the foundation, their diverse stories of loss and reclamation woven together to create a powerful narrative about resilience, community, and self-redefinition. Seeing the impact of the work through their eyes brought me to tears. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked as the credits rolled, his arm warm around my shoulders. "More than okay," I assured him. "I'm just overwhelmed by how far this has all come." From that night, I left with just an overnight bag, not knowing what would happen next to this. A film, a foundation, a completely new life. "You built this," he reminded me gently, step by step, choice by choice. "We all did," I corrected him. "Everyone in the film, everyone at the foundation. It's been a collective reclamation." In the weeks that followed, the documentary generated significant attention. Requests for interviews poured in, along with speaking invitations from across the country. More importantly, women began reaching out hundreds of emails, letters, and phone calls from viewers who recognized their own struggles in the stories portrayed. The foundation established a special response team to handle these contacts, connecting women with resources in their local areas when possible, and offering online support groups for those in isolated regions. What had begun as my personal journey of reclamation had evolved into a movement much larger than myself. As spring bloomed fully, I found myself in a moment of rare, quiet reflection, sitting alone in the garden behind our apartment building, watching bees navigate the flowering herbs I had planted in raised beds. The groundskeeper had initially been skeptical about my request to convert a section of the manicured lawn into a productive garden, but had eventually been won over by the beauty of the result. In this peaceful space, surrounded by life I had nurtured from seed, I contemplated the approaching 3-year mark of my departure from my marriage. 3 years since, I had walked out of a life that was slowly suffocating me. 3 years of rebuilding, rediscovering, and reclaiming. I thought about Alexander not with longing or anger, but with a complex mixture of compassion and clarity. I could now see him as a complete human being, rather than either the idealized husband of our early years, or the villain of our final chapter. A flawed man shaped by his own history, making choices that ultimately diminished both of us. I thought about Vanessa, whose email had revealed a young woman beginning her own difficult journey toward self-awareness. I hoped she would find her way to authentic identity beyond the reflection of others' desires and expectations. I thought about Eleanor reinventing herself in her 70s, proving that reclamation has no expiration date. About Catherine, who had supported me through the darkest days and now flourished in her new relationship. About Daniel, whose patient understanding had shown me what true partnership could be. Mostly I thought about the woman I had become, someone I wouldn't have recognized 3 years earlier. Not because I was fundamentally different, but because parts of me that had been buried were now fully expressed. The writer, the advocate, the leader, the woman who knew her own worth without needing external validation. As I sat in that garden, fingers stained with soil, sun warm on my face, I felt a profound sense of peace. Not the empty calm of resignation that had characterized my final years with Alexander, but the rich stillness of purpose fulfilled of alignment between inner truth and outer life. The path from betrayal to reclamation had not been straight or simple. It had included moments of devastating pain, crippling self-doubt, and overwhelming fear. But each step, however faltering, had led me here to a life built on my own terms, filled with work that mattered and relationships that nourished rather than depleted. When Daniel found me there an hour later, returning early from the bookstore, he didn't immediately speak. He simply sat beside me on the garden bench, respecting the contemplative mood he sensed. "I've been thinking," I said finally, my voice soft against the background hum of bees and distant traffic. "About what?" he asked. "About change, about how the most painful disruptions sometimes create space for the most necessary growth." He nodded understanding immediately. Like a forest after fire. Exactly 3 years ago, I thought Alexander's betrayal was the end of everything. I couldn't imagine a future beyond that devastation. I turned to face him fully. I had no idea it was actually the beginning of this, he said, gesturing to encompass not just the garden but all we had built together. The beginning of me. I corrected gently, the real me unconstrained by someone else's expectations or limitations. He smiled, reaching for my soil-stained hand. "I'm grateful every day that you found your way back to yourself, that I get to witness who you truly are." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across our small garden sanctuary, I leaned my head against Daniel's shoulder, content in the knowledge that my journey of reclamation had transformed not just my own life, but rippled outward to touch countless others. I had once believed that love required diminishment, a constant pruning of self to fit within approved boundaries. Now I understood that true love, whether for another person or for oneself, demands the opposite expansion growth, the courage to occupy the fullness of one's being. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by plants I had tended, and beside a man who celebrated rather than constrained my becoming, I made a silent promise to myself to never again surrender my voice, my truth, my essential self. To continue the work of reclamation, not just for my sake, but for all the women still trapped in silence, still believing their worth depends on others' approval. The journey wasn't over. Perhaps it never would be, but I was fully present for it now. Eyes wide open, heart engaged, spirit unconfined. This was what freedom felt like, not the absence of connection or commitment, but the presence of choice, the ability to say yes from conviction, rather than fear, to build a life aligned with internal truth, rather than external expectation. As stars began to appear in the deepening blue above us, I felt a profound gratitude for the difficult path that had led me here to this garden, this moment, this authentic life. The price of reclamation had been high, but the reward was beyond measure. the simple, extraordinary privilege of being fully, unapologetically myself.